So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Global Schools session today. We're really excited to have you here to discuss mainly the UNESCO Greening Curriculum Guidance, but also some other things and interesting projects that our speaker has to share with us. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Amanda. I'm the director of the Global Schools program. And today we're going to be hearing from our speaker, Professor Felisa Tibbitts. And so I will do a brief introduction to her before handing it over to her. We have about an hour here for her presentation and also a question and answer period. So as we're going through the session, please put your questions in the chat. And for now, we'd love to hear where everyone is calling in from. Please put where you are in the world, just so we get a sense of the diversity here in the Zoom room. I know we always have a great diversity on our sessions. So we'd love to see where you're from in the world. So just to get into the session and introduce our speaker, Professor Felisa Tibbitts, her research interests are really around human rights, global and democratic citizenship education, education for sustainable development, curriculum policy and reform, critical pedagogy, and human rights in higher education transformation. She has an extremely impressive bio. She's been a professor at many different organizations. She's also published practical resources on curriculum and program development on behalf of the Office of the UN Higher Commissioner for Human Rights, UNICEF, UNESCO, and in many other official journals and publications as well. And here we're really going to hear from her in her role as one of the lead authors for the UNESCO Greening Curriculum Guidance. So I could talk about her profile for a long time. It's very impressive, but I will hand it over to you, Felisa, to take us through the session today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for that introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm so impressed by all the different places where you're based collectively. So then, good afternoon, good evening, good morning for those who it applies to. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today. And Amanda, it's such a kind introduction you gave me, but I have to say that two things. One is that if I have an impressive resume or whatever, it's only because I'm really inspired by what I do. And I hope that you are also really passionate about your teaching, your education, and your engagement in this case, I think, with environmental sustainability, climate change education, ESD, whatever frame you use. The second thing is that I have the privilege really of getting to do teaching at higher education at times, other kinds of research and working with other organizations. But my heart is really in the teaching piece. And for those of you who are in the classroom who are working with learners, your work is the most important. So, my admiration goes out to you and my respect. And I hope that I can offer something today to you that will be inspiring or useful in some way. So anyway, welcome everyone. And now I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, here we go. Can you kindly confirm that you can see my screen? I'm going to set it up so it looks nice. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can see them.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, super. Thank you. All right. So, Amanda, thank you again for this invitation. Amanda invited me to not only present briefly on the greening curriculum guidance, because you can read it for yourself, but to reflect a bit on how it was developed. So, like the insider's view. And then I'm going to also share with you what I've sort of been doing since. I've had a couple of projects since then, one of which is perhaps closer to your interest, which has to do with curriculum development. So this is my plan for today. I'm going to be, sorry, I'm moving around things on my screen. So here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the greening curriculum guidance for UNESCO was developed. It only came out last June. It was a very intensive process involving myself and 6 other authors, actually. And then I'm going to, in that context, talk a little bit about what were the considerations when we were beginning to develop the curriculum guidance, and then some of the things that evolved, came up as issues as we were writing it. Again, if any of you are writing curriculum, even if you're doing your own lessons, these are, it'll probably, some of this might resonate with your own experiences. And then I am going to take the liberty of sharing with you a couple of things that I've been working on since last June, actually, that has moved pretty quickly, and may, again, I hope will be of interest to you. And I'll hopefully leave enough, plenty of time for us to do some Q&A. So of course, the whole frame of the backing up just a little bit, UNESCO has, of course, a long-standing involvement, first in environmental education, and then in education for sustainable development. So ESD is something that UNESCO had elaborated on. There was even a decade, I think, for ESD. So it has been some time that they've been working on those concepts, the three pillars of social, economic, and let's say, and science, those pillars of ESD. But I think partly because of youth activism in the last 5 years, UNESCO began, and other influences as well, like the COP processes, they became more focused on climate change education specifically as a subset of interest within ESD. And that was part of the impetus for the Greening Education Partnership, which is a collection of organizations, including UNESCO, focused on what they call greening the curriculum or greening schools, and other related initiatives. And the greening curriculum guidance is really, again, it's focused, it doesn't call itself a climate change education, but that's really what it is. It's a scope and sequence for climate change education specifically. So that's kind of the story, also a little bit of UNESCO's evolution in this area, going again from ESD to something very specific to climate change education. Okay, so when we started, UNESCO recruited many of us to write. I don't know who all the people they recruited, but we ended up with the team. I was the lead author, so my job was to do the literature review, and to do the final section on implementation, and to basically oversee the whole writing and editing process. So it was a big job, but I had amazing, wonderful co-authors. There were 6 people that were brought in, one each to do I'll show you one of the I think key topics. There are different ways of organizing. I'll tell you in a second. So there were 6 different sections of the main part of the curriculum guidance, like climate justice was one. Another one was the greening of the economy. So there was one author for each of those. And then we had somebody who was working specifically with TVET, with vocational education and training, so that we could also integrate those considerations onto the greening curriculum. So we had different authors, we had an allocation of tasks, we had to sort of sort out how we would be, especially addressing the main sections, the ones that probably mostly of interest to you, which were, those set up by the key pillars, if you will, of ESD that we migrated over to climate change education. And I'll show you a graph in a little bit. So we had to sort out those tasks, who would be doing what, and a lot of figuring out how to set up each of those pillar sections, again, which I'll show you in a second. So if any of you have developed curriculum with anybody else, you have to do a lot of sorting out, not only of who does what, but to make sure that it all holds together in the end. With so many authors, there was a lot of work with voice and writing style. That was a lot of my job. But it was also an iterative process. We were not only looking at each other's work, I was looking at their work, the core UNESCO staff at headquarters. We were looking at each other's work, but it was also going out regularly for review by UNESCO staff throughout the world, as well as to the the Greening Education Partnership, because it was considered a really high profile document. So it was a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But by and large, the feedback we got was really, really helpful. And it was a very amicable process. So there was no catastrophes in terms of us having to rewrite a lot of things. The writing staff itself, I should say, which was somewhat diverse. We had I think one of the writers was from Morocco. We had one of the writers from Kenya. We had one of the writers from China, actually. We had someone from Canada. We had two Americans. And then we had somebody from England. So it was not entirely balanced, global north, global south, but we had some variation there. And the people at the UNESCO staff were also having different geographical backgrounds. So one of the things I had to do first was figure out what would be the guiding principles for working climate change education. I'm going to share that in my next slide. We did understand this was part of UNESCO's position because they had developed a concept paper before they brought in the authors. We knew that we wanted the greening curriculum guidance to be in at least involving in principle the idea that every actor in society needed to be involved in sustainable behaviors, even if this scope and sequence was for teaching. So that would be from pre-K, by the way, so preschool, all the way to adults 18 plus. We knew that inside of that curriculum, we wanted to recognize the role of municipal authorities, of NGOs, regular citizens, community members, school members, etc. So we wanted to have that flavor in there somehow. We also are working off of what was already well established with UNESCO's ESD work, which is we knew it wasn't just going to be talking about the natural sciences. It was going to be the social sciences, potentially the humanities, even including arts and language education. So we didn't have, this isn't a, so this guidance is not subject specific. You'll see when I give you an example. We did have one part of the greening curriculum guidance where we gave some creative examples of how you could address climate change in subjects you might not have thought about, like mathematics. So we do have some examples of that. But anyway, this was part of our orientation, that we wanted it to be a wide frame so that you as teachers, those of you who are teachers, if you were a teacher in, say, in citizenship education, you could go and find your place there. Or if you were a teacher in language learning, you could find something that would be relevant for you. So it was like a large menu of sorts. We did, again, following the ESD pathway, recognize that we were going to be doing dimensions of learning, including cognitive, social, emotional, and also behavioral. And and I'll talk a bit about what was challenging, but we really wanted actionable outcomes, especially, it's always a good idea if you want to be motivating and involving young people in their communities to have something actionable. That goes without saying. But when it comes to the climate change, also define productive ways for young people to be doing something in their communities. This is all about, of course, the work that you all do as part of this project, so it's very familiar to you. But we also were very cognizant of wanting to have actionable outcomes. And then, of course, that also relates to localization. Climate change phenomena is to some degree different from community to community. If you're dealing with flooding, or if you're dealing with droughts, heat, etc., the status of the use of energy sources. There's so many variations that would be important to take into consideration. And these were all things we also had to keep in mind. So in talking about the principles, this is part of one of the sections I wrote, which had to do with the kind of the principles of the greening curriculum guidance. And so after I did my literature review, I kind of pulled together this really long list, you can see, of some of the principles from ESD and other work that had been done, maybe by yourselves, maybe some things you did found their way into the literature and I read about you. But we ended up with this kind of sort of, if you will, this wheel of that overviews some of the characteristics of quality climate change education. And I mean, in some ways, if you go to the outside ring, you might argue that it's actually relevant for anything you teach. But we sort of worked on some of the details related to climate change education. So, of course, action oriented. You can read this for yourself, including involving in transformative education. This is language UNESCO is using a lot now, transformative education. Justice promoting, so talking about gender, human rights-based approach, intergenerational equity, intercultural equity. We could have had indigenous influence there, but we put it actually under quality content because we wanted it to be really central to the curriculum. And I myself have been learning as much as I can in the last years about indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous science, indigenous stewardship of the earth. And so one of the things I did do personally when we were working on the scope and sequence was to insert that as much as we could. And now it's also considered part of quality education. And Amanda and I were chatting beforehand, and I know that's part of the work of global schools as well. So quality content, including evidence-based, work in climate change education, and it being comprehensive and relevant. So you can go back and read this. I mean, I don't know if Amanda, I guess you'll be sharing this recording. So if you want to go back and study this, or you could just Google greening curriculum guidance and you could find this, I think, pretty easily. So really quickly on some of the things that were kind of a challenge for us. So I just wanted to share that with you. So because we did have so many authors, we had altogether 8 authors, including myself. It really was a little bit of a challenge at times to make sure all the language was consistent. Use of verbs, not everybody was a native English speaker, so there was that challenge at times. So I was a busy beaver, as they say, but everybody was a really great thinker and a very good writer. So it really, in the end, worked out very, very well. But because we also had people across the world looking at the drafts, we also, for example, our attention was brought to language and nuance, and we had to sometimes really explain what a term meant in English so that it would be really clear for people whose native language was not English. The actionable outcomes, that skills pillar was hard, because I don't know, for those of you who develop curriculum and you're interested in like skills and behaviors, things like critical thinking skills, which of course we all love. I really felt that those needed not to be in the skills and behavior, that not in the behavior not in the behavior dimension, because for me, that needs to be actionable outcomes. And I see critical thinking and other kinds of intellectual, skill sets as related to learning. So we moved like critical thinking and other kinds of exercises and ways of working intellectually into the cognitive dimension of the outcomes. And we left for the behavior ones, things to do in your community, like public outreach or doing some research, this kind or presentations, this kind of thing. So, but that was something we had to sort out. And I'm not sure we're entirely 100% confident with what we came up with, but we tried to make it really clear so that even if people couldn't do some of the teachers, some of the actionable outcomes we were suggesting, it might inspire them to come up with something that would be doable in their own environment. So again, this is not a prescriptive kind of a resource at all. It's not a curriculum. That was also a stress we had at times. People saying, well, these aren't lessons. They're just like one step before, like literally a scope and sequence. I'll show you what's in it. So, but we had to sometimes, have sufficient details so that it would be inspiring for educators. And at the same time, we didn't want to be so overwhelming, but we did end up with a pretty long document. So again, it was, again, trying to develop something for policymakers, because UNESCO's main partners are governments, and that means ministries of education. So we had to develop something that ministries of education could use. They could bring in curriculum writers, review their own national curriculum, and come up with a frame maybe that integrates climate change education. But we also wanted to have enough there for those of you who are in the classroom, in higher education, or in with younger students, or with non-formal ed, that you could take some of what's in there and develop something that works for your learners. So we're trying to keep that in mind. And again, the non-formal and formal versus kinds of educational approaches, we also tried to keep in mind, knowing that UNESCO is primarily working with governments, but of course wants this to be useful for many different kinds of organizations in many different educational settings. Just to check in, Amanda, am I speaking too quickly? Should I slow down just a little bit?
I think this is good. Yeah, if people have questions, please put them in the chat, and I can also field them with
Okay.
Lisa. So feel free to put questions in the chat. I've been answering some of them. So,
Okay, thank you. Okay, so these were some of the challenges we had. So now I'm just going to do a little brief overview of what's actually in the Greening Curriculum Guidance. If you haven't seen it, this might interest you to take a look. So, and I stumbled earlier trying to remember if it was pillars or concepts or topics and key ideas. That's one of the things we had to figure out. It was like a cake with all the different like tiers of ideas working from key concepts within which we had top key topics and then we had key ideas. So it was really complicated. But anyway, the key concepts, which you might consider the pillars, were the ones you see in front of you now: climate science, ecosystems, and biodiversity, which were clearly related to the natural sciences. Then we had climate justice and resilience building, which is more, I mean, it kind of is more cross-disciplinary, but certainly related to the social sciences, especially climate justice. That one really having to do with thinking about civic action and trying to influence people who have power around policies and practices related to greening. So it could be municipal authorities, it could be national authorities, it could be private sector actors, etc. Post-carbon economies, of course, clearly having to do with economics, and so typically that would be in social sciences or some kind of, yeah, some social sciences related discipline, subject matter, and sustainable lifestyles, really then going into the what individuals can be doing themselves. So that's kind of cross-cutting, could be used in any environment, any subject really, if an educator wants to sort of bring it home. So these were, and each of these key concepts had a different author, and each of them had a set of topics. And so we had key topics, and then we had within each topic ideas and learning outcomes according to age group, with some consideration for TVET. So you can see we had to do a lot of thinking, a lot of thinking before we did the writing. It was so much work. I look at this, I don't know how we did it. But anyway, this gives you an idea. So here we have the environmental, social, economic. These are the original pillars from ESD. So the environmental, social, economic, that was from before. And then you have the six, what did we call them? The six key concepts, right? Six key concepts. And then inside of these key concepts, you can see some of the topics, right? So there's a lot here. So just I'm going to give you a minute just to look at it. I'm not going to read it to you, obviously, but you can see there's a lot here. Now, we did our best to make it kind of I'm not sure I would argue user friendly. I mean, we're hoping that if you're motivated, you'll go there and you'll see topics of interest, right? Inside of each of these topics, like let's say under sustainable lifestyles, we have engagement with nature. And inside of engagement with nature, you'll have key topics according to different age groups with learning outcomes. So there is a kind of a level of detail that could be, we hope, really useful for you developing lessons. Or if you're working at the ministry level and you're working by subject matter, you might be able to find inside of here something related to, for example, life skills education or social sciences or economics or history even, or biology or environmental science. So we hope you could find that. Or if you're working transversely in the ministerial level, you could also find themes, cross-cutting themes that could be used in different subject matters. Of course, it's also non-formal ed, higher ed goes without saying. So I'm going to focus just a little bit on the climate justice one. You can see that is one of our six uh, our six key concepts. And I'm focusing on climate justice because I'm a human rights person and because I'm also going to talk a little bit about the work I've done since then, and it has been more oriented towards eco justice. So I'm just picking this one. I hope that will be, if that's okay with you. So this is just to show you also, and this is the definition that we developed for climate justice. We had an amazing a writer, Christina Kwok, working on the climate justice key concept. And she works a lot on gender equity and climate and ESD, climate justice in particular. And you'll see here, I think I'm really, really, if I can say it this way, proud of UNESCO having something like this in the green curriculum guidance, because this really gets into some of these structural issues that some of us care about, north-south issues, inequities, problems of climate change related to basically capitalism and the market economies. So it's here. And UNESCO has this language of transformative education, as you know. And typically we're thinking about transformative education as it pertains to like pedagogy and methodologies, which is perfectly fine. But this climate justice concept also moves us into thinking about systemically what has contributed to climate change and some of the things we maybe need to be addressing in order to have really, if you will, a sustainable solution. So here we see the definition. Maybe you've been reading it already. On the one hand, looking at the drivers of the climate crisis, again, moving across the root causes, including, social systems, political systems, economic drivers, harmful power relations, systems of discrimination, etc. Really strong language. And then also getting into climate justice related to the future looking fair allocation of the burdens of the impact. So again, it was partly looking historically at the roots of the climate change related to these harmful power relations and economic drivers, but also looking ahead what needs to be done, again, trying to mitigate with climate change and having a fair, a kind of responsibility by the global north. I mean, this, as you know, this is really problematic now in the global community dealing with mitigation efforts. But it's right there. It's right there in the reading curriculum guidance that climate justice is important, and this is something to be considered. So I was really pleased with that. Here is what Christina came up with. She came up with only 4 key topics. Most of the other writers came up with a lot more key topics, but here you see how she addressed climate justice, contemporary manifestations, social determinants, historic economic and political processes, and transformed futures. Really nice. So that's what she did. Again, might be interesting for you to look at. Here, I just want to show you how it was set up if you haven't seen the reading curriculum guidance. So we have this topic, historic economic and political processes. We have a definition. Then here you can see the 3 dimensions of outcomes: cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioral. Notice we don't have skills there. Again, anything related to like critical thinking skills, etc. Those went under the cognitive. Here we have the key ideas. The key ideas are related, but they're kind of different by age group. So for 5 to 8 years old, human actions in the past have long-lasting impacts on the present day. And then it moves to, and there's another key idea for younger people. Some people today have benefited from human actions in the past while others have suffered. Now that's pretty powerful stuff for young people, but you can see we think it's really doable. That, of course, was always a challenge as well. And some of the people that were our authors really, especially the woman, I should say, who was working in the field of economics, she found it really challenging to come up with key ideas related to economics that would work for 6-year-olds. So bless her heart, she figured it out, I think. But for some of the topics, it was a little harder to come up with ways of making it palatable for younger people. Anyway, I'm going to just leave it at that. I figure you can go back and look at the reading curriculum guidance. I want to briefly mention, because Amanda asked me to talk about implementation. So I did write the section on implementation, but it was primarily geared to ministries of education. So the really final section of the greening curriculum guidance really was geared towards ministries of education. And there you have what you might expect to see, which is sort of guidance that it's rather generic, but well, I mean, it's not like we're inventing anything trying to integrate ESD or climate change. So it had to do with reviewing existing policies. In fact, Amanda and her team have been working on this. We worked together on a guidance for actually helping to review the presence of ESD, both in government policies and in education policies, and also in subject matter curriculum. And that guidance note, which Amanda can maybe pop that link into in the chat box, also had some, that resource also had some advice. It's a handbook on how to go about developing lessons to help fill that gap. So anyway, so there has been other work on this as well, and it's a nice complement, I think, to what we worked on, Amanda and her team and myself, as a handbook for the Global Schools program. So this is similar. So we have, except that this doesn't go into the details. I referenced the Global Schools materials in it and drew on some of the ideas as well with credit to it. So developing curricular strategies, a detailed curriculum, piloting. This is all very familiar. And then, of course, as with any other new initiative, you need to develop learning resources, help textbook writers if need be with their work. You can't assume they're going to have, if they're going to know all of this. And then moving into pre-service and in-service teacher training, thinking about the whole school approach as well. I don't know to what degree you all are thinking yourselves personally about whole institution approaches, whether it's in your primary school or higher education, but this is also a really important approach. And the same time that UNESCO released the greening curriculum guidance, they released the greening schools guidance. So there's a whole guidance that UNESCO also has on the whole institution approach. And they call it, I should say whole school, they call it whole institution because it could be for schools, it could be for higher education. It could even be for your civil society organization. And of course, we always have that you're supposed to monitor and assess the results and improve what you're doing. So this is all pretty familiar, and but it's not really related to the micro level, the classroom level. So at this point, I think if people are okay with it, I'm going to shift gears. And I'm going to shift gears into what I've been working on in the last year. If that's okay, Amanda, do you think I should stop now and take a few questions, or can I move to the projects I'm working on? What do you think?
I think that you can move to the projects. I've only see like one or two questions here, so I think people can think about their questions and put them in the chat, and then you can continue talking about your projects now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're really shifting gears now. So what happened was last fall I was in Oslo in Norway for a month. I was working with the European Vergeland Center. I was on a Fulbright actually, and they had just decided to and the European Vergeland Center was co-founded by the Ministry of the government of Norway and the Council of Europe, which is a regional human rights institution. And the Vergeland Center had just decided before I arrived, actually, that they wanted to integrate ESD into the work they were doing, and they work with teachers across Europe. They have a resource center, online resource center, but they also have very specific grants. They get to work with countries like Poland, Romania, Ukraine, and other places. But they're working primarily in the area of citizen, because of their mandate from the Council of Europe, they work in education for democratic citizenship, intercultural education, anti-racist education, human rights education, really pretty much in that area. And most of their network of teachers is also in citizenship education. So that because of that, we agreed that what I would work on is I would take the greening curriculum guidance, which I just shared with you, and I would develop initially only 6, and then we extended it into 12 lessons because we got feedback and wanted to do more, but 12 lessons that could be taught within citizenship education. So it was in specifically through the frame of citizenship education, and we also decided not to be just climate change education, but environmental sustainability. They wanted it slightly broader. So again, not sustainable development, but environmental sustainability. So we kept that environmental focus, and we did have climate change, of course, as a part of that. I'm going to show you just the lesson topics in a moment. You'll see what we ended up with. We decided that we wanted the lessons that they could be taught individually, but if teachers had the space, across the 12 lessons, they could be taught sequentially, or they could pick a cluster. Some of the lessons are just one lesson, others are required 2 periods. And that's always a challenge when you're trying to do something that's hands-on and actionable. Oftentimes, you're doing something in the lesson to set students up, and then they have to go do research, or they have to do some community project. And that always takes more than one lesson, either to present their work or to do the research, etc. So we set it up so that it could be done as flexibly as flexible as possible. They also work with NGOs, so they wanted something. We decided that the lessons I wrote would be within a 15-minute time period, but that obviously if it was with an NGO and they had an hour and a half, they could extend it or they could have two different lessons. So we were mindful of that. And we really, really wanted it to be, having the youth voice. So I am, coming from the field of human rights and citizen action. It was sort of very natural for me to think about actionable outcomes for youth. And it was always a challenge when you're an adult working on lessons that youth will like to make it that it's fun, that it's not too complex. So I was sort of my own worst enemy at times because I wanted to keep it to one lesson. And then sometimes I was trying to cover too much ground. So it was a process that right now I got feedback from the staff and now it's out being piloted by teachers. So we've got two teachers piloting each of the lessons. So, but the staff at the Vergalon Center, I was there for a month and they were really excited about this. What was amazing for me, and maybe for you all, I don't know where you all are working, but the staff, whether they were working in media, whether they were working in, they were accountants, whatever they were doing in the Vergalon Center, they had a staff about 12 people. They were super interested in this topic. So at first I did a training for them where I said, hey, here's the 6 lessons I'm thinking of doing. And I did one lesson, draft lesson with them. What do you think? And they were like, really excited. They gave me great feedback on the lesson I did. It was on sustainable lifestyles. They gave me great feedback for them. And then they gave me other ideas. And so we decided, oh, we need to do more than 6 lessons. So it turned into a dozen. And then also, I did another training for them at the end of my stay there, got more feedback. And then, as before it went out for piloting this last month with teachers, the staff was also involved in giving feedback. And one of the lessons, one of the staff decided they wanted to write, and that's fine. So we also had them directly involved in the writing. Super, super cool. So these are the 12 lessons we came up with. Again, this is, by the way, it's being piloted now, but this is going to be open access. So Amanda, it also, I mean, I don't know how much of this overlaps with work you might be already doing with teachers, so I don't know if it would be, the same or different. But these are the 12 lessons we came up with. And again, these were developed so they would be possible to integrate into subjects related to the social sciences and specifically citizenship education. But I think it would also go with, say, the life skills, primarily for 13-year-olds and older. It could, some of them, we have actually, I don't show it here, but we actually have 4 different sections. For each of the sections, we have at least one lesson that could be used with 10-year-olds. But even when you go to higher education, if they haven't had any kind of background in this area, you can go dig into, the secondary school examples and use them. So even though it's geared towards 13 years old and 8 to 18, because they're working primarily the Vergalon Center with teachers teaching in middle and lower and second and upper secondary schools. I think these could be used with NGOs in higher education, and it could be adapted in some cases for younger students. And we do have, again, a few oriented towards 10 and above. So here we see the introduction to environmental sustainability. What is it? We realized we had to start from scratch, if you will. And then lesson 2, really thinking about environmental democracy, how important it is for citizen action, not only our own behaviors, but those behaviors of those like our government officials and private sector actors, and the importance of our being proactive about trying to influence them and policies and behaviors they have. And then again, looking forward, lessons 1 to 3, the futures and futures work. That's part of the antidote we know to nihilism and depression around climate change is, the research is showing, is futures thinking, imagining alternative futures, and also doing things actively in your community, working with others, doing things active. It's really good for people's mental health and also is very, very important for the community work in. So we tried to integrate all this actionable outcomes things for what we need to be doing for climate change, but also to protect the health of young people. In fact, we have in the introduction to this resource, I have a whole section on dealing with emotions related to climate change. Because when I was working with the Vergalon Center and the staff, the very first training I did, I looked around the room at some point and everybody was so just anxious and upset. I mean, when we're working in environmental sustainability and climate change, we're all kind of, I mean, I think a lot of us are used to this now, but there are people for who are, they're thinking about it a little bit, but then, you start really getting into a lesson and it hits hard, right? So I think just to recognize that we have a whole introductory section on dealing with climate emotions. We even have for this outcome, this research come out this fall, it'll be open access, a kind of even a questionnaire you could administer for a self-check for young people or learners about what they're feeling, how empowered or not they might feel about dealing with climate change, and then or environmental challenges. And then you could administer at the end of your lessons and see if there's been any improvement. So we're really mindful of that element. Anyway, as you can see, lesson 4, youth-led climate action, because there's so much going on there. Thinking about human rights, the right to the environment. So again, a way to bring in human rights because there is a lot happening around the right to a healthy environment at the United Nations. There's other kinds of work happening around whether the environment itself it can be considered a rights holder. Super interesting. Climate justice, looking at some of the issues that I already showed you in my previous slides. And then sustainable lifestyles, we ended up with 2 different lessons because people found it so very interesting. And of course, this is what learners, their own behaviors related to the use of public transportation. One of the people on the Vergland Center staff were like, really like, young people keep buying disposable clothing. They're just wasting their money on cheap clothing. They've got to learn to wear, to use clothes for a long period of time or buy clothes that have been used by others so that we're not consuming all this energy on disposable items, this kind of thing. So sustainable lifestyles, a lot of really practical things there. The lesson on Indigenous peoples and sustainable development, looking at, in this case, this is one of the lessons. I had a lesson on Indigenous peoples, but somebody from Norway said, we need something on the Sami in Norway. That's the Indigenous peoples in Norway and Northern Europe. They worked with the Sami issues already, and they said, let's have something looking at the sort of tension between Sami's use of land for reindeer herding. That was they're nomadic and they herd reindeers, and the need for space for establishing alternative energy locations and that conflict between over land. So we have that. And then sustainable schools, cities, climate action planning. I'm really excited about this curriculum. Again, we're piloting it now. I'm going to finish my revisions by the end of September, and I think by the end of the year it'll be available. So Amanda, I'll let you know when it's available, so maybe you can circulate it through the network. I'm excited about this, and that is so. I'm not sharing with you more detail about this, but it does give you an idea about how you can take the scope and sequence and translate it into lessons, and you might find some of these really useful for you. So now I think I really didn't want to do too much more, but I'm going to take Amanda another 5 minutes to really briefly talk about some of the sort of the scholarship I've been working on. So here, I know you might be already full in your head with all the other things I've been presenting, but if you'll allow me to, I'm going to like really quickly talk about this other work. So I am as a quote unquote human rights person, and interested in social justice. I really wanted to dig into that a little bit more around a climate change education. So in particular, I'm interested inside of climate change education, climate justice, also known as eco justice, right? So that was really of personal interest to me, and I really felt like you have a sort of recognized sub area of climate justice. I presented a little bit on that earlier, and I did that so that it could link up with what I'm presenting with you now. But then there's this whole area called decoloniality, as you know, decoloniality in the field of education and research. And some of that's pretty theoretical, but there's some really key ideas, like focusing on historical inequities related to unequal power relations that shows up through colonialism, for example, and lingering effects of colonialism. So it has to do with those systemic injustices that have driven climate change that I mentioned earlier, that's in the greening curriculum guidance. It also has to do with indigenous ways and people's of knowing, thinking about the disproportionate negative impact on people who are vulnerable because of histories of colonialism and maybe poverty, living in sections of of land, parts of the land where are that are more vulnerable to droughts and flooding and so forth. So these, I felt like me and Mikalinas Zembalis, I don't know if you know him, and another former student of mine, we thought we really have to put together some of the thinking of the decoloniality with climate change because they go together so well. They're really mutually reinforcing. So what we decided to do is we really thought that we should look at decoloniality, and we decided to look at ESD more generally because we wanted to look at a case study, and we thought it's kind of early to find climate change education already in national curriculum. But we thought, hey, it's been decades of education for sustainable development, so let's look at ESD or something like that. And think about decoloniality. So that's what we decided to do. So we wanted to think about what other people had said in the literature, and then we decided if we could, we'd look at a way to taking the idea from the greening curriculum. What would it look like to have decoloniality showing the principles of decoloniality showing up in ESD curriculum, national curriculum, and what might we suggest for the future based on those findings? So what we decided to do is to look at South Africa in their national curriculum because South Africa has, of course, a very pronounced history now in decoloniality, post-apartheid, even though the theory of decoloniality really emerged from the Latin American context, the post-dictatorship period and the post-colonial period. We thought to look at South Africa also because Michelinas and I have worked a lot in the South African context with the Nelson Mandela University most recently. So we decided to do a keyword search of the key policy education documents in South Africa. And also we looked at 17 different subject matter curriculum in the pre-primary through secondary school level, natural sciences and technology, life skills, and also social sciences. So really, it was a lot of work, a lot of work. And on the bottom here are the keywords that we used. You can see on the one hand, we were looking for indications of the environment, and we had lots of smaller things like climate, nature, etc. And then sustainable development as a term itself. And then we looked at all these other things that we thought were related to decoloniality, like vulnerable populations, gender, indigenous, coloniality, apartheid. We added actually, because it turned out that was really more what was in the South African context. They weren't talking about coloniality. They were really focusing on the apartheid period. But before apartheid, there was coloniality, by the way, but that wasn't showing up. So we just thought rather than just say it's not there, let's include apartheid. And so we did look apartheid. You can see power relations very related to decoloniality, et cetera, et cetera. So we did the research, and we basically found almost nothing that was related. We only found one area of all the policies we looked at and all 17 subject matter curriculum. We only found inside of agricultural sciences and management anything that seemed to bring together ESD and decoloniality. And that's because they mentioned indigenous methods inside of agricultural management and sciences, which is really cool. They had a whole section on it, so it wasn't superficial. But otherwise, if we found gender, if we found power, it had nothing to do with ESD or climate change. Like it was gender was just more general. And we talked about power. It was division of labor between local municipalities and the National Ministry of Education. So surprisingly, nothing, really nothing. And, we had different explanations or speculations about why that was the case, but we were a little surprised. And we do feel still that it's an area of future work. So I'm going to conclude now with, for those of you who work in policy development, I know that Amanda's also working with Indigenous peoples and ESD, but I'm still working further with now Michelinas and I are working on a second article that's really trying to put together something conceptually, looking at transformative education, UNESCO's work, and how we can bring decoloniality and climate and change, especially eco-justice, together, because we think it's going to be good for both sides to have a more explicit attention to decoloniality, to move that into eco-justice will strengthen that effort inside of climate change education, and vice versa, those of working in decoloniality, to ground that in the actual immediate urgency around addressing climate change. Also very important to ground decoloniality in those realities. So we're thinking that these are some of the recommendations we have to bring those things together. And then there are these fancy terms, decolonial eco-pedagogy, again, moving in indigenous knowledge systems, environmental stewardship, localized conceptions of sustainability, and then epistemological pluralism, also really big phrase there, but has to do with looking at decoloniality and their questioning about the nature of knowing and knowledge, and historical definitions even of disciplines coming from the global north, and thinking about how to work outside the box of even disciplines. So, I mean, you all working as education or ministries of some kind or policies. This is a little bit sort of esoteric, perhaps, but I mean, Michaelinas and I are really convinced that this is going to be a really productive and fruitful exercise to bring together decoloniality and eco-justice and see what it comes up with. Thank you for your attention. I know that went a little longer than expected. I really appreciate your attention. Here's my email address if you are interested to reach out to me. I'm happy to be in touch with you. And again, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. It was really, really great to get the insights on the greening curriculum guidance and your work, Felisa. I mean, you've done so many different projects, so I think it was really great for this group, and we really appreciate your time also putting this all together. We have a lot of questions in the chat and some tough questions, so I've been trying to organize a little bit here.
Okay.
And one really maybe question you could answer quickly, and apologies, there's some construction in my apartment, so you can let me know if you can't hear me, okay?
I don't hear you're fine. I don't hear any noise.
Okay, great. So the pilot project that you were talking about with the lesson plans, where is that being piloted? Maybe you could answer that.
Okay, fine. So it's being piloted by the teachers that are part of the European Vergaland Center network. So the countries are that it's being piloted in includes Norway, includes Romania, includes Estonia, it includes Ukraine. They do a lot of work there. Um, there's another Poland as well. So they're working because it's the European Vergaland Center. They're working primarily in Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So they're not piloting it in. I don't think they're piloting it in any North African countries, for example. They have some links there now, but it's primarily in the European domain. But it's being piloted in the classroom, which is great. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it was one of the questions that came up in the chat. I've been trying to put some of them together in different categories. One of the questions that actually just came up was based on the last portion of your presentation. Do you have any recommended readings on decoloniality or alternative ancestral ways of knowing for educators, or any resources that you recommend to kind of get into these topics and teach about Indigenous ways of knowing?
Yeah, great question. But Amanda, that goes back to you too, because I think you've been working in that area. So I think you should maybe answer that part of it. For that question, most of the resources I have paid attention to, because what I've been working on is more scholarship. So it's more research oriented, has been more on theories of decoloniality and indigenous ways of knowing. So I have been focused primarily on like eco-pedagogy, for example. And so it's a little bit like maybe one step removed from practice. I mean, I have like a folder full of like scholarship on decoloniality. I did find some resources thinking out loud on eco-pedagogy, for example, and climate change education. I mean, I did find some resources. So maybe Amanda, I can go look. I mean, the flavor of the question is looking for practical resources, right? On teaching, right? Not on scholarship, because I can send along a few things related to scholarship that might be interesting, but not so much on the teaching part. Would that be useful?
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, we'll share the recording with everyone and any particular
Okay.
resources. And maybe to answer your question, we're working on this a little bit with our project in the Amazon part of SDSN, which is the science panel for the Amazon. They work with over 300 scientists, and some of them being indigenous scientists, and we're thinking about how to support in different education areas as well. So this is a lot of this is upcoming, but we can definitely put together some resources on this.
That's great. And I love that question. I'd love to see those resources too, by the way. Great.
Great. Okay, so a couple more questions here. If do you have like 10 more minutes, Felisa, for
Absolutely no problem. Yeah.
Okay, great. There was a question going back to the greening curriculum guidance on, since you worked on the implementation section, how do you see implementation being tracked, or do schools receive any support, or developing countries receive support on this? So maybe you could talk about the tracking of this or how this is seen by UNESCO.
Absolutely. And that's a great question. I'll answer it to the degree I can. So the greening curriculum, the greening education partnership that I mentioned earlier, this includes UNESCO, it includes like Education International, it includes organizations like World Vision, Save the Children. So it's a combination of, they're all international in terms of their where they work, but they're not all international government organizations. They're also non-governmental. So the Greening Education Partnership has is taking the greening curriculum guidance forward, both within their own organizations and in terms of dissemination. So just as an aside, there are, like, even when we were working on the greening curriculum guidance, those of us who were working on writing it were feeling like, oh, we should be giving something more to teachers. I wish we could. And we were sort of getting a sort of a comforted by, if you will, comforted by the at UNESCO staff said, no worries. Like, we have already, I think it was Plan International. They're already planning to take the greening curriculum guidance and work on some curriculum related to gender and climate change education. So the expectation is that individual actors inside of the greening education partnership would move it forward. So that's one answer. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure what's happening with those individual organizations. I do know from the UNESCO side that they did receive funding, and they're doing a combination of technical advice to ministries of education that were interested, or a more complex project where they go in, help with mapping what's already happening in terms of greening the curriculum. That's the language they're using, not as much climate change, but that is what it is. So they're going in with, I think there's a subset of countries, at least 10 countries they're working with now, to bringing experts. I'm not involved in that. I really didn't have the time to do it, but they're bringing in experts to do work with the National Ministry of Education to do mapping studies and then develop some curriculum. So I know they're doing with at least 10 countries, and I think they're primarily in the global south. That's my impression. So I know, in addition to the individual actors in the greening curriculum, the greening education partnership, they are working on some technical assistance now with ministries, but nothing is public yet. But that's happening. In terms of monitoring, the Global Education Monitoring Report, GEM, which is it's associated with UNESCO, and it's also associated with UNESCO's Statistical Institute, which is based in Canada. UIS is the acronym. They have, they regularly collect, they use UNESCO provided data on national curriculum examples, and they regularly monitor every couple of years. I think they monitor the status of different themes inside of national curriculum. Sometimes they also look at textbooks, but usually it's national curriculum, I think. And they, for example, did something, I think it was in 2016, they did a review, GEM did a review, Global Education Monitoring Report, that looked specifically at education for sustainable development and its presence in national curriculum. So you can actually Google GEM, GEM, and UNESCO and environmental education, or ESD, maybe that's what you want to look for, and see what they found. They did find that there is a strong foothold, but that there's still room for improvement. They also talked about it primarily still being in the natural sciences. So that's also an area for improvement that we're looking for in the future, where you find climate change education or ESD, not just in the natural sciences, looking at biology and environment, environmental science. So probably GEM is going to continue to be looking at that. Also in Europe, there is a separate European organization looking at ESD that has been following really closely what's been happening in the context of Europe, where there's I think a little bit of a higher representation of ESD than maybe other parts of the world, according to the GEM report. So I think that those are the entities that are that are already regularly monitoring themes, not only ESD, but other themes that are probably going to be monitoring it in the future. But who knows, there might be other initiatives underway that will be more autonomous ones, not maybe looking across the world, more regionally, or maybe in a subset of countries. I'm not sure. But Amanda, are you involved in any way in monitoring and evaluation for ESD in your network?
So we, as part of the Greening Education Partnership and some other mechanisms, we have participated in some of these more systems level monitoring, sessions for especially for the 1973 recommendation by UNESCO, which is one of the major bodies of, monitoring for countries. So we have given inputs to some of those things. And then a lot of the stuff is also done at the school level. Our teachers send us in, different things
Mhm.
what they're doing when it comes
Mhm.
to assessment. There was actually a question on assessment as well on from the classroom standpoint and using the UNESCO guidance, and if you had any advice on assessing kind of the difference in students' attitudes and values and behaviors, kind of
Mhm.
using what's in the greening curriculum.
Yeah, that's always the thorny question, right? Hey, but you remind
Yeah.
me of something, Amanda, this question also about monitoring, and really these are great questions, of course. I want to recognize, the 1974 recommendation from UNESCO that sort of validated working in peace ed and citizenship education, human rights education, interculturalism, and so forth. That was updated in 2023. Really big deal, right? And so you're reminding me that the UNESCO revised recommendation from 1974, which is now the 2023 recommendation, has a really more pronounced space for education for sustainable development because it's linked with SDG 4.7. So my guess is that there actually is going to be follow-up to the 2023 recommendation somehow. That'll probably be linked with SDG 4.7. And then, of course, that's always linked with the ongoing monitoring that UNESCO does with GEM. But maybe with 1974, that revision to 2023 and the ESD being so pronounced, we'll see renewed or enhanced monitoring around ESD. So we'll see. So assessment, so thorny. We had this big discussion also, of course, writing the grading curriculum guidance because we have a scope and sequence. So just like we didn't go into, we have a whole section on pedagogy. I mean, like a lot, land-based land-based learning. Of course, that's very relevant for ESD to experiential problem solving oriented, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, what we decided to do is just have a section on assessment. And it's not going to be unfamiliar to you if you've been doing this work. So it's assessment that's learner-centered, that it's developmental. We have some that's linked with the kinds of learner outcomes that we care about. That's actionable. Um, we do have a section in the Greening Curriculum Guidance addressing assessment that I did work on using the literature. But it's honestly, I don't think it's going to be anything that you haven't thought about. So you're welcome to go to the Greening Curriculum Guidance. You can find the assessment section there. It does not include like lots of details because again, this was a scope and sequence document that was originally going to be 80 pages. 80 pages. And we writers literally laughed. We laughed in one of the meetings with the UNESCO headquarters, like, you've got to be kidding. There's just no way. So we ended up with like 160 pages. So we had to stop at some point. So we don't have examples of really cool, interesting ways to do assessment. Similarly, we don't have like really cool examples of like lessons that use pedagogy in a creative way. I'm sorry. But if you are interested, please check out our assessment section. We did have some general guidance, and we do also have quite a few resources. So maybe they're hyperlinked. So maybe you can, follow those leads inside of the main text to the resources that we have in the back, and they'll lead you to some assessments. So I apologize that I can't offer you more than that, but hopefully that section will be useful to you.
That sounds great. We just have about 5 minutes left here
Okay.
before we have to hop off this Zoom account and share it with another team today, which is amazing. We have
Oh yeah.
a lot of sessions happening today. It's also
Okay.
the launch of SDSN Sustainable Development Report, which is really exciting. And there's some questions here in the chat, Felisa, about the scholarship that you mentioned and the eligibility. I might have missed this part because I was trying to look through all the questions.
Yeah, scholarship is not funding. It's scholarship like as in research and writing.
Okay, okay, perfect.
Sorry about that.
Clarify
And
that.
by the way, thinking about assessment, it just occurred to me. What is it? Um, just a second. The one of the things that's also come out, it's not going to be helpful for you in the classroom, but because ESD is getting elevated increasingly within, within and across intergovernmental organizations, I'm not sure about your view about PISA, for example, and cross national assessments related to learning, but ESD and some of the things related to environmental education are already in being there are questions for them inside of TIMS, I think in PISA, and I think that OECD is thinking of increasing the numbers attached to ESD. So I think there's going to be more in the future. That's not going to affect your classroom assessment, but it will again help to give a snapshot of learners' understanding of environmental education, which could be a further impetus for ministries of education infusing more into their curriculum. So that's another avenue in for motivating governments to do more. So sorry, scholarship does not have to do with finance. It has to do with our research and writing. Sorry.
No, that's great. I was wondering if I missed something on that because I just wanted to clarify that for some of the participants. So maybe since we do have a lot of teachers on this call, I'll ask you this question, which is a little bit more specific to the classroom. So do you have any advice or tips to really deepen understanding of sustainability beyond, sometimes we fall into things like celebrating Earth Day or Environmental Day? How can we get more of the whole school involved, students and parents, to really become aware and do this more intentionally?
Well, I mean, that's a question for all of us, right? And we all have our own answers. So a part of it, I think, is sustainable lifestyles. I mean, then it gets really, and you could do that in the classroom, and then it's really doable. You're having learners reflect on where they buy their food, how do they get to their learning environment, energy use. I mean, and if you're looking, and then you can lift that up, and in the home, those and the home, how what their practices are, and that's easily lifted up to the schools. There's lots of literature out there on greening schools, like doing a review. You could do a kind of audit for the school, like if you have a cafeteria, are you using plastic utensils or not? Where does the food come from that's used at the cafeteria? So there's loads and loads of things that are very practical that you can be using as a way to learn about sustainability and identify areas of improvement. So I think that's a great way to start. And it's all about, especially when it's so overwhelming what we're dealing with now, having things that we can think about in our own lives, in our own schools, in our own homes, our own higher education institutions. So I would definitely encourage you to look at things related to sustainable lifestyles. I've got a couple of lessons coming out later this year, but maybe you can find them elsewhere. Really interesting, I think, lessons. But also, there's also quite a bit out there on greening schools, including the UNESCO work, very practical things that you can be doing. Now, I want to say, as a person interested in climate justice, we also don't want to think that individual behaviors is enough in terms of our sustainable lifestyles. It's also, we want to be having green homes and green schools, but that's also not enough. We still have to push our policymakers to work towards, greening policies. So it's not instead of that. But if we work first in our own critical self-reflection in ways that have us forward looking, futures looking, doing something that could make a difference on a small scale. I think that's where we want to begin, right? With learners' experiences and actionable outcomes.
Well, thank you so much, Felisa. I think we'll stop there with the question.
Okay.
I know there are a lot of questions still in the chat, but I think Felisa shared her information. I encourage all of you to read through the UNESCO Greening Curriculum Guidance, also for more details. I think Felisa did a great job highlighting the key parts as well, which thank you so much for
You're
that.
welcome.
For also giving us an insight into the writing process, which is also really interesting. So thank you once again for your time. Thank you to everyone on the call. Also to say, please follow the Global Schools channels and UN SDSN channels, as we will be launching the Sustainable Development Report today, which is one of our flagship reports where we rank different countries on the SDGs and policies. So I encourage you to check out that resource
Right.
on our channels.
Great, great.
Yeah,
A
so
pleasure to be with you all. Good luck with your work. Do write me if you have another question, and I'll share a few more resources with you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody. You have a great rest of the day.
thank you all.
Bye.